he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your minds not on the divine things, but on human things." May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. So as we hear this passage from Mark today, all I can think of is poor Peter. Just before this particular passage, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter emphatically responds that he is the Messiah. Peter, he gets it. Peter has seen Jesus' miracles, listened to his teachings, and he gets it. Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah that he has been yearning for. But when Jesus shares that he is to suffer and face crucifixion, Peter rebukes him. And Jesus must take him to task for not getting it, for not understanding. For all that Peter has learned about God, Jesus doesn't meet his existing worldview and understanding about who the Messiah should be. So here's Peter, who's next to Jesus every day, learning from him, watching his every move for a long time. Based on proximity alone, he should figure this out. But he's not really going to figure this out until he watches Jesus personally suffer, actually be crucified. And when he sees for himself that empty tomb, it is only then that he will truly understand. So despite his proximity, Peter is still relatively early in his journey towards truly understanding what it means to follow Jesus of Nazareth. As we turn to this reading from Genesis, we hear the story of covenant between Abraham and Sarah and God. If you know the book of Genesis well, it's the second covenant between Abraham and God. The first one dealt more with receiving land, but this is really about receiving their son. Now, when the story is taken like it is this morning by itself, it's a story of the promise, of the hope that can only be found in God. But now, that promise is to include and be fulfilled with Sarah, who, despite all the odds against her, she will miraculously give birth to Isaac. But there's a problem. If you recall, a story that we read and talked about a lot during Advent, that story about Hagar. And it's the story that comes immediately before this in the book of Genesis. Now, there's 15 years that are in between, but narratively they are connected. They are one right after another. And that was the story of Hagar and the announcement of her son Ishmael. And in that story, if you recall, Hagar encounters an angel of the Lord because she is fleeing Sarai, because of how Sarai has been treating her. And remember, that word actually means she was abusing her. So Hagar flees, God delivers her. And then God blesses her, much in the same way that God goes on to bless Abraham, not only with progeny, but that their sons will be fathers of many nations. God delivers her and sides with the one who has been oppressed. Now, if you continue on in Genesis, you'll know that things didn't get any better, because later Hagar and Ishmael are expelled by Abraham and Sarah. They are left alone to die in the desert and eventually need to be delivered from certain death again by God. So despite, and this is where it becomes a real challenge for us, despite how they treat Hagar and Ishmael, God blesses Abraham and Sarah again. How do we reconcile God delivering Hagar and then blessing the ones who abused her? Now, we can understand this story as being framed and written by Abraham's descendants who want to paint him in the best light. We can see it through the lens of many scholars who understand that many of these stories throughout the book of Genesis, they were edited and compiled during and after the Babylonian exile. Those are legitimate explanations, but they don't really get at the heart of the issue for us as people of faith. That these stories and these actions are simply not aligned with who we know God to be. And this behavior, this blessing, is incongruent with our expectations of God. So again, you'll hear me say this on and over again. We have to wrestle with these complexities of these stories and to not gloss over them, which unfortunately our lectionary typically does. Again, we only hear this story normally. But we live in a time when moral clarity is critical, especially with regard to the abuse of human siblings. So it's especially important for us to not turn away from the realities here, to not gloss over them, and to not wrestle with them and talk about them. And I would posit that that's especially important during Lent. It's a time when we are called to examine our individual lapses and sinful treatment of others, and critically examine how both our actions and our inactions harm others. Lent is an important time, and it's an important step in our discipleship and preparation for the journey to the cross. And I would hold up journey as being a really, really important word in that statement. Identifying sin in these stories should be about helping ourselves identify our own sin, which hopefully is going to lead us to some change. Now, I think one of the powerful things about Abraham and Peter's stories, they're pillars of our faith. It's important for us to see them journey. We see them struggling with doing the right thing. We see them fail. We see them sin. Even though they both encounter the fullness of God, they struggle. But yet, they journey. Eventually, Peter even abandons Jesus, but he continues to journey. Abraham loses faith in the promise, and he does some awful things to Hagar and to others, but he continues to journey. Now, we don't excuse the behavior, but we recognize their humanity in their failures. So why are Abraham and Sarah allowed to treat Hagar as they do and still receive the blessing from God that they do? How do we square God privileging Abraham and Sarah and Isaac eventually over Hagar and Ishmael? These are questions that are not answered in the book of Genesis. Now, take a step back. We should also recognize that none of these individuals, flawed as they are reduced to only their worst deeds. But these stories highlight to us that God is continually drawing them and drawing us into a journey, meeting us where we are, sin and all. It's a journey towards true covenant with a loving God that is always drawing us away from wrong choices, harming others, or being apathetic towards the suffering of others, and always towards love, drawing us towards faithfulness and self-sacrifice, and ultimately drawing us towards the cross. We see how shocking this revelation is when Jesus, God incarnate, says as much to Peter's face. If you want to be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. The journey towards God is not through wealth, power, or security. It's through love and grace and giving up everything of yourself for the good of others. That seems far-fetched and totally foreign to Peter. But still, God invites us on the journey towards love and to the cross. For God yearns for us to experience liberation through the justice that can only be found in and on the cross. Not just the wood of a tree, but the transformational power of love. A love so powerful that it conquered death and sin. Now, one of the things that flows out of this is coming to the understanding that God is at work with everyone. And that opens the door to the possibility for liberation for everyone. It doesn't make the horrible things that are done better, but it creates a path forward for a journey towards justice, a journey and a cross that is ultimately open to everyone. Now, Peter, if you think about him in first century Roman Judea, he understands that the cross is the worst of humanity. It represented violence and hatred. It was meant for criminals, not for the Son of God, not the Messiah, not the cross. But what he fails to understand is what God is going to do with that. What God is going to do with the worst of humanity. Peter's imagination has been so restricted, and he sees the world only as it is, and not what it could be, not what God might do with it. Peter's narrow vision limits what he understands about God, but that doesn't limit who God is or what God is going to do. Jesus will suffer. He will die on the cross because of the sins of human beings. But God takes that sin, upends it, and transforms it into life. So where Peter is lacking in this understanding of how the journey to the cross is a journey towards solidarity with all people, God's justice is going to be made manifest in the world through that cross. Where Peter misses that God will transform the ultimate symbol of the worst of humanity into this instrument of justice and liberation from all creation, the fact that he misses that doesn't change the fact that it's going to happen. Because Peter is ultimately on a journey, and he will eventually get it. Abraham eventually does as well. Because God stays with them on that journey, even as they falter. And God will stay with us on our journeys too. And God will continue to draw us all towards the fullness of life that is found in one place, the redemptive liberation of the cross. It's a journey that involves covenant. It's a journey that involves self-sacrifice. And it's a journey that involves emptying ourselves of everything that separates us from the love of God. But make no mistake, friends, it is a holy and sacred journey that brings us into the fullness of life and liberation that can only be found in communion with love divine, a love found embodied nowhere else than in the life of Jesus Christ, and redeemed by his cross. Amen.